So I'm going to be giving kind of a practical talk about how we might address some of the difficulties which arise through the lack of official data that comes around the work of the home. The UK census has for a long time struggled to understand or measure domestic work. In fact, as far back as 1904, the Registrar General reflected on the way that women's work in the home, and it's not moving forward. Yeah, there we go. The Registrar General reflected on the way that women's work in the home had been classified before then, writing, he said, in 1881 and earlier, daughters and other female relatives of the head of family who were described as assisting in household duties were classified as unoccupied. In 1891, however, it was considered that the nature of daily occupations of such persons being thus evident, they would be properly reckoned to be in domestic service. In deciding on the rules of guidance of the clerks of the recent census, that is 1901, however, we came to the conclusion that, on the whole, it would be better to revert to the method of the 1881 census. The British authorities were, it seems, unable to imagine housework as work, even when, as he says, the daily occupations of such persons was evident. This lack of desire to precisely record who does what within homes continues to frustrate attempts to understand the organisation of domestic labour. The need to obfuscate household work that's done by women is still very much alive and well. But while to a certain extent the unpaid work that family members do has become better recorded than it was in Victorian times, the work of paid domestic workers and of au pairs has too often been obscured. Since the 1970s, the classification of domestic workers within the census has changed a number of times, in part because it was thought that domestic service, as it's too often called, had been done away with, like gaslights or bustles. Changing forms of domestic work, such as part-time cleaning, au pairing and nannying, presented challenges for the census, meaning that there's a substantial undercounting of this kind of work. And by 1991, the census showed just 30,000 people employed as domestic workers and au pairs in London. Today, I want to look at the particular problems around counting au pairs, a form of migrant domestic work that officialdom within the UK has left almost entirely unmeasured. The 2021 census did invite householders to list their au pairs as members of their staff. But it will be very interesting to see what the outcome of this is, not least because other government guidance, for example, from HMRC about taxes, tells families very specifically that au pairs are not employees or workers. So what I want to begin by doing is outlining what au pairs are and why it is we don't know very much about them within the UK from any official data. And then I'm just going to talk briefly about proxies I've used in my research to count au pairs and other forms of domestic workers before concluding by outlining some of the issues that we found with the lack of official data. So, what are au pairs? Au pairs have been a very significant source of childcare and domestic work for UK families for decades. Estimates vary and there are no official figures, but we think that around 60,000 families hosted an au pair to provide childcare or housework, less commonly elder care, during 2020. Au pairs are generally young people from another country who live with what are called a host family, and they help with childcare and some housework in exchange for being given room, pocket money, food, and opportunities to improve their language skills. For example, before 2008, the UK had an au pair visa, and these were the rules of it. And in order to get the visa, an au pair had to be unmarried and without dependent children, relatively young, studying English and doing part-time housework, but not substituting for a nanny, so they couldn't be in charge of very young children. And in exchange for this, they had to be given their own room, all their meals, and pocket money to an amount stipulated. Au pairing is very specifically set up as something which is not permanent migration, nor work, nor full-time study. It has its roots in informal exchanges between middle-class families, and this atmosphere of a kind of slightly privileged informality has remained with it, meaning that au pairs are rarely understood as low-paid migrants, nor in need of any kind of protection. When there was a visa, so before 2008, au pairs had to register with the police on arrival, and data was kept by the Home Office on the number of visas issued and renewed. However, when the visa was removed in 2008 as part of the move to the points-based immigration scheme, these numbers were no longer available. Since 2008, the UK has relied on EEA, EU, freedom of movement to allow au pairs into the country, and a very small number of people under youth mobility. So from 2008 onwards, we have no official data on the arrival of au pairs. And to add to the confusion, the visa was also the only place where au pairing was defined. So when the official visa on the guidance was removed, so was a definition of what an au pair might be. Since 2008, we've seen the rise of things like live-out au pairs, nanny au pairs, housekeeper au pairs, and much more. The difference between paid domestic workers, particularly nannies, and au pairs has diminished significantly, but we have no official data about them. This has caused a number of problems, which I will come to, but you can start to imagine. And so in my research, I've been very interested in trying to establish the extent of many forms of paid domestic work, including au pairing. And in order to understand the size and patterns of these forms of work, I've, over the years, used different forms of advertisements as proxies, and then triangulated findings from analysis of adverts with interviews with particularly people involved in the sector, people employed, people hosting or employing, and also people like employment agencies. Using ads has the benefits that they're free, they're freely available, and relatively standardized. They have the downside that the outcome of the ad, did somebody get the job? Did they work in those conditions? This all has to be implied. They're very effective for showing change over time and differences between places, but less precise as an absolute measure. So when I first started my research on paid domestic workers, it was for my PhD, and this was a very long time ago. This was before advertising on the internet was a thing. So I did analysis of printed ads from The Lady magazine. It wasn't quite as long ago as 1885, but it was when print was still the thing. The Lady had, for a very, very long time, been a kind of main source of advertising for domestic roles. And by using classified ads, I was able to identify the types of roles being advertised, details such as a pay being offered, and also location. Some ads gave a location by name, some by postcode. Others, and this was before cell phones, had a phone number, and I was able to reverse look up the codes and match them to postcodes. They don't match, and this is the most laborious thing, but it is actually possible to do. What this has allowed me to see is a relative concentration of jobs within particular areas. I was interested in London, and I was then able to use that for outcropping, to do a survey in the area with the densest concentration of ads, and to find out how the ads I was seeing related more widely to the sector. What I ended up with was a rough picture of what was going on, but it meant that I knew I had a baseline, a reasonable understanding of geographic patterns, and the method is replicable over time, backwards and forwards, until internet ads start to take over. More recently, I've used an online equivalent of this methodology based on ads on Gumtree.com. Gumtree also works well because it's free, So unlike agencies or many online platforms, you don't have to register to look at Gumtree ads. And also you get a wide spread of people posting ads there because they don't have to pay to post them. So people who aren't prepared to spend any money to find an au pair would place an ad on Gumtree. It's geographically segmented, so you can look at ads by area, and the advertisers write free text. This means that we were able to carry out qualitative data of Gumtree ads, as well as coding the text for quantitative data. The downside is that turning the text into countable data is time consuming, but it is very, very rich. So as part of a study of what had happened to au pairing after the abolition of the visa, carried out analysis of 1,000 ads, which allowed us to establish the average working hours, pocket money, and the sorts of roles being offered. So again, this gave us the ability to see to what extent au pairing was shifting without any regulation from government. It gave us quite a lot of insight into what people hosting au pairs thought they ought to be doing. By looking at the ads, we could see that the posts were being filled very rapidly, that they weren't there for any length of time, and also things like they were very concentrated in London. We were also able to see that the pocket money offered, the working hours expected, and this huge range in both of these things. We were able to document the lack of distinction between au pair and nanny roles, and that the majority of au pair posts being advertised were for positions that fell outside the old visa definition of an au pair. This was most commonly because they involved the sole charge care of very young children, which traditionally is meant to be done by nannies, but it also could be for reasons such as they were live-out posts, that they demanded somebody who already spoke fluent English, or that they involved a form of work which was neither housework nor childcare. So we found ads for au pairs to help with businesses, to look after pets, this kind of thing. In order to understand more about the nature of au pairing, this kind of data has to be triangulated. It doesn't kind of exist on its own. We know that not all hosts advertise on Gumtree, and that not all au pairs work in the conditions that are advertised. And so by also talking to au pair agencies, to host families and au pairs, we were able to kind of see how these ads fit into a wider universe, but still maintain this broad base of quantitative data. Our conclusion was that we were probably not seeing the families who employed au pairs in the very best conditions within these ads, but we were also missing ads or a picture of families who were recruiting from outside the UK directly. More recently, families who wanted to recruit from outside the UK have a whole host of matching apps that they can use. So this is one called Au Paired. There's a huge website called Au Pair World. They estimate they placed 21,000 au pairs in the UK in 2015 alone. And actually, you can do analysis to a certain extent on this, particularly to see the way that particular characteristics such as nationality, gender, age are foregrounded by either hosts or au pairs, but there are limits because of the registration. These sites give us an indication of the relative size of markets, the effects of deregulation. So, for example, we found that ads do not reflect rules about gender or race discrimination in job searches, but it's much harder to glean in some other ways. And, you know, there is a real need to look across multiple sources and to check and recheck as far as possible. But despite the fact that using these proxies has been very successful in all sorts of ways, there are also problems. And if they're not done with care and on quite a large scale, they're not really going to kind of replace any kind of official or widely gathered data. So, for example, one of the problems that we've had is because there's no official data collected on au pairs, there was no impetus on the part of the UK government to contact au pairs around settled status when the Brexit rules were introduced. And in fact, it was the EU who made the effort to reach out to UK au pairs, to contact them, to tell them about their need to register for settled status. And that was a really laborious activity because there were no records of them. The lack of official data means that the government also resists paying attention to the conditions that au pairs and many other domestic workers work in, and it resists regulation because of lack of data. Most recently, there was a legal case, an employment tribunal, where a domestic worker was claiming for back pay of minimum wage. This is a real technicality, but domestic workers quite often aren't paid minimum wage because of an exemption to the minimum wage called the family worker exemption, which is related to au pairing, which is a great technicality. And this case was defended on the basis that the family worker exemption to national minimum wage is inherently discriminatory on the basis of gender, because the vast majority of domestic workers and au pairs are female. The government countered by saying there was no data to prove that domestic workers are female, and therefore they didn't see any reason to get rid of the family worker exemption. So they refused to collect the data and then say they won't act because there is no data. In fact, in that particular case, the tribunal was successful, and we've been able to use the proxy data that I gathered as evidence to the Low Pay Commission. So the government have been instructed to now look into this and to start collecting data. So there are real issues with the lack of official data. Proxies and alternatives can be used and are valuable in the absence of official data. But there's also this really important ongoing issue that governments will count things that they're interested in, and that not being counted too often means that you don't count in policy initiatives. Thank you.